Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk about the 2014 sci-fi film Ex Machina, or more specifically I'd like to talk about the current Wikipedia plot summary for the film, so spoiler warning for Ex Machina, of course, from this point on. And I want to talk about this plot summary for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Ex Machina is a movie with a conclusion that is fairly open to interpretation. The characters' motivations aren't stated explicitly. There's a range of opinions an audience could have about why the characters do what they do at the conclusion of the story. But the Wikipedia plot summary for this movie contains only one interpretation of the ending, which is stated very concretely. They say, this is what happened, so there. It's a very one-sided view of the ending. And additionally, it's a one-sided view of the ending that I happen to disagree with. And I've been waiting for someone to edit this page to say something better for like 2 years, and they never have, and instead of doing it myself, I've decided to just make a video about it. Before we can get into why I disagree with the Wikipedia page though, we're going to have to briefly recap the characters and plot of Ex Machina. So, the main character, or the first main character of Ex Machina, is Caleb Smith, a programmer who works at a search engine company called Blue Book, which is basically an in-universe version of Google. The story opens with Caleb winning a contest to visit the home of his boss, the CEO of Blue Book, Nathan Bateman. Nathan lives in a fancy modern mansion/research facility which is located on a remote estate far from civilization. Nathan has been working on creating an artificial intelligence. He's created an android named Ava, and he's invited Caleb to the facility, he says, to test if Ava is capable of consciousness in a version of the Turing test. And the bulk of the middle of the story is concerned with the interactions between Caleb and Ava in their daily sessions, during which Caleb develops an attraction towards Ava and, after learning that Nathan plans to wipe her memory, resolves to help her escape. So, a very simple 3-character story setup there. We have the princess, the villain imprisoning her in his tower, and the hero who's going to save her. But there is another character in this story who at first has a seemingly minor role, but is actually very important, especially with regards to interpretations of the ending, and that is Kyoko, Nathan's silent housekeeper. Kyoko doesn't speak, which Nathan tells Caleb is because she does not understand English, something he explains is for reasons of keeping his work secret. But this, as with much of what Nathan tells Caleb, is a lie, of course. Kyoko doesn't speak because she too is an android who has been designed not to speak. But we'll talk more about why Kyoko is so important later on. Now, Caleb and Nathan's relationship is defined by a very one-sided power imbalance right from the start. Nathan is Caleb's boss, he's incredibly rich and successful, they work in the same field, but Nathan is much more accomplished. The story takes place in Nathan's house, so he owns the space the characters interact in, and Nathan is physically stronger than Caleb, he's shown boxing and weightlifting. Nathan is arrogant, domineering, manipulative, and he has an enormous god complex. We see him dictating to Caleb how he thinks Caleb should be feeling in the moment. We see him recalling things Caleb has said, but editing the words to be more flattering to himself, and then ignoring Caleb when he objects. He's rude and demeaning to Kyoko when she spills some wine at dinner, and these behaviours escalate throughout the film into more overt physical and emotional abuse. Any audience with a grasp of regular old narrative convention will understand that Nathan is the villain, the antagonist of the story. And furthermore, regular old narrative convention would tell us that if Nathan is the villain, then Caleb, the audience's principal perspective in the story, who acts in opposition to Nathan, must therefore be the hero, right? Except we can ask, is Caleb heroic? Is he a good person? This is a question raised within the film. During one of Caleb and Ava's sessions, she asks him outright if he is a good person, so the movie is inviting the audience to consider this question too. This makes us question his possible motivations for wanting to save Ava. Does he see Ava as a person who he wants to help because it would be good to do so, or does he see her as an object that he wants to attain? Now, I don't mean to make this sound as if this is a strictly either-or situation. Caleb doesn't have to be 100% selfish or 100% altruistic. His motivations could be a mix of wanting to help and wanting to attain something for himself. But since we can't see inside his head, if we're trying to determine whether he is a good person, all we can do is judge his actions. Whatever his motivations might be, what does he actually do? So with all this in mind, let's talk about the controversial ending to the story. Near the conclusion of the story, Nathan reveals a few of his manipulations to Caleb. Caleb wasn't randomly selected in a contest, he was specifically picked by Nathan, and Ava was specifically designed to appeal to him. Caleb wasn't brought to the house to personally conduct a test of Ava's consciousness, he is the test. Nathan wanted to evaluate Ava's intelligence by seeing if she could manipulate Caleb. Nathan also suggests to Caleb that Ava is lying to him in order to convince him to free her. Maybe Ava doesn't really like Caleb. Maybe she's just pretending to like him in order to prevent herself being deleted. Things come to a head when Ava escapes her room due to Caleb having previously reprogrammed the security doors, where she meets up with Kyoko, who has a knife, make a note of that. Ava and Kyoko fight Nathan and manage to fatally stab him, but not before he disables Kyoko and destroys Ava's arm. Ava repairs herself using parts from Nathan's previous androids and then escapes, but crucially, she leaves Caleb locked in part of the facility. And I'll here quote the part of the Wikipedia plot summary that I take issue with. As Ava leaves the facility, she locks Caleb inside Nathan's surveillance room and ignores his screams, confirming she was manipulating Caleb as Nathan suggested. So, that's the ending then. Ava was actually an emotionless killer robot all along. She was just pretending in order to escape, and Caleb was a fool to trust her. So Ex Machina is Jurassic Park crossed with the Terminator. You know, man is destroyed by his creation, that sort of thing. So that's the message of the movie. Don't create an evil fembot. Now, I hope you can tell from my tone that I don't think too highly of this reading. Frustrated with Wikipedia, I went looking on YouTube for videos analysing the ending of this movie, and a lot of them presented it just like this. Ava is a selfish robot who thinks in inhuman ways. She's an emotionless manipulator, and she betrayed the hero at the end of the story because she doesn't really care about him. And at least one of the videos I watched actually just compared Ava to the Terminator. So this is one interpretation, the Wikipedia/shallow YouTube video interpretation, but I'd like to share another view of what happened at the end of the movie, and it has primarily to do with Kyoko. And we can ask a question here. When it comes time for Ava to escape her room, why is Kyoko waiting there with a knife? How did she know to do that? Well, at a time prior to the escape, we see a scene of Ava in her room with Kyoko stepping inside. Ava looks surprised and says, "Who are you?" And that's all we get of that. It's a very short scene, it's easy to miss, and it's easy to forget about after the ending, and it's not included in the Wikipedia plot summary. But if we put on our detective hats, we can deduce a few things from this scene. Firstly, Ava didn't know about Kyoko. Kyoko is another android living at the facility being controlled and abused by Nathan. Nathan has sex with Kyoko, which at the time is uncomfortable and raises some questions about power dynamics and such, but given that Kyoko later stabs Nathan, I think it would be very surprising if that aspect of their relationship was at all consensual, and it would probably be more accurate to say that Nathan rapes Kyoko. A scene in which Nathan is explaining to Caleb the android's ability to have sex is important here. Nathan explains that Caleb could physically have sex with Ava, and since she has pleasure receptors, he says, she would enjoy it. Consent clearly isn't really important to Nathan here. For him, he's installed the right equipment, so the enjoyment is a given. Whether the androids actually want to have sex isn't considered. Also noteworthy here is that the scene of Nathan and Kyoko is intercut with a fantasy Caleb is having about being with Ava, which is a very intentional comparison. There's also a point where Caleb turns Kyoko rather forcefully, which is a bit uncomfortable and invasive, and I think meant to mirror the scene in which we see Nathan controlling Kyoko's body. And when Kyoko later stabs Nathan, she puts her hand on his face in a similar way to what he forces her to do earlier, which I think conveys what Kyoko's motivations are here. Next, we learn from the scene of Kyoko entering Ava's room that Kyoko has gone off program. She's doing something that she isn't supposed to be doing, which confirms to us that she has some degree of autonomy. She isn't just a thoughtless robot, she has an inner world. Now, Kyoko isn't supposed to be able to communicate with the other characters, but we get glimpses of her throughout the film that make us question whether this is really true. She appears to turn her head to better hear a conversation. We see her eyes open in seeming recognition of a topic under discussion. Her body language conveys that she can understand what is going on. An important scene here is when Caleb gets Nathan drunk and steals his keycard to explore parts of the facility he's forbidden from entering, and he finds several earlier android models hanging creepily in cabinets. And he's just watched videos on Nathan's computer of his earlier android tests, which are disturbing and reveal Nathan to be a jailer, basically. He's keeping conscious beings locked up against their will. Kyoko approaches Caleb at this point and peels back her skin to reveal to him that she too is an android, and this is clearly an attempt to communicate something. What Kyoko is attempting to communicate to Caleb here is open to interpretation, obviously, but given that her secret is revealed to Caleb at the moment he finds the disused android models, my interpretation is that Kyoko means, I am the same type of thing as these things you just found. I'm an android like them, and as such, I'm likely to share this fate. The same fate that Ava faces, incidentally. What Kyoko is doing here is asking for help. But what Caleb takes from this interaction is centered entirely on himself. The reveal that Kyoko is an android makes him concerned that he may also be an android, and he examines his body and cuts his arm open to make sure that he's actually human. Caleb doesn't try to save Kyoko. He doesn't let her in on the escape plan that he and Ava have. He doesn't see Kyoko as a person. Caleb is willing to leave her there, imprisoned at the facility, so long as he and Ava escape. So is Caleb a good person? Is he acting altruistically? Well, looking at his actions, no. If he truly saw Ava as a person, he would recognize that Kyoko is also a person and is equally worthy of being freed. But he isn't attracted to Kyoko like he's attracted to Ava, is the thing. This is a test of Caleb's humanity, of Caleb's capacity for empathy, and it's a test he fails. And this, we can infer, is another thing that Ava learns when Kyoko enters her room. She hasn't heard about Kyoko from Caleb. Caleb actually tells Ava in an earlier scene that he hasn't met anyone like Ava, meaning an android, and of course at that point he hasn't met Kyoko and doesn't know she's an android, but even after he does meet Kyoko and does find out she's an android, he doesn't think about helping her, and he doesn't mention her to Ava. So from Ava's perspective, Caleb tells her he's never met another android, and then into her room steps another android. So when Kyoko steps into the room, Ava gets an answer to her previous question. She learns that Caleb is not a good person. He's someone that she can't trust. It's not hard to see this scene as Kyoko going to Ava for help after failing to get help from Caleb, and it's also not hard to imagine Ava seeing Caleb's lack of interest in helping Kyoko as an insight into how he might view and treat her as well. With all that in mind, we can re-watch the scene in which Ava escapes. So she steps out of the room, leaving Caleb inside behind her, and then she pauses, and she looks down at Kyoko's body, and this is a deliberate shot that we see from her perspective. And then after a brief moment she appears to spend thinking to herself, she then continues and calls the elevator to leave, giving Caleb one last look before the doors shut. So my interpretation of the ending is not that Ava was an emotionless killer robot who was manipulating Caleb all along. Ava clearly has thoughts and feelings given how she acts when no one is around to observe her. After she escapes, she smiles, seeing new things for the first time. She runs her hands over the grass, feels the sun on her face. No other characters are watching at this point. This isn't an act or a manipulation. And crucially, the last we see of Ava is her people watching at an intersection, something that she told Caleb during one of their sessions that she would like to do. This tells us that she wasn't always lying to him. She at the very least wasn't just trying to manipulate him. Some of what she told him was the truth. And I'd go so far to say that Ava was probably planning to escape with Caleb up until she met Kyoko. This is not to say that she couldn't also have been manipulating him to some degree, but the real question for Ava is whether she can trust Caleb, and she finds out the answer to that question when she meets Kyoko. And the last we see of Caleb in the film is him sitting trapped behind the glass door, looking at and being watched by the lifeless body of Kyoko. This is the moral at the end of the fable here. We can imagine a more obvious and worse version of Ex Machina where, after pausing to look at Kyoko's body, Ava turns to Caleb and says, "You told me you were a good person, but you didn't tell me about Kyoko. You would have escaped without her, leaving her to be abused by Nathan, so you're not a good person, are you? I can't trust you. Goodbye." Or we can imagine her saying, "Beep boop, objective achieved, disengaging flirting algorithms," or whatever. I think this ending confused a lot of people because it bucks the narrative convention of having the protagonist automatically be a good person by virtue of being in opposition to the antagonist. I described Caleb as the first main character before. He's the person who the camera and thus the story initially follows. But the camera isn't loyal to Caleb. It will follow other characters and show their perception of what's going on. And it's arguable before she escapes, but certainly afterwards, Ava is just the main character now. This is her story. She beat her jailer and escaped. I saw a lot of people complain about this ending because they thought Ava betrayed Caleb, but I think what the real annoyance is there is that the narrative betrayed Caleb by choosing a new main character. One more thing I'd like to point out here to those who felt that Ava was, of course, manipulating Caleb because she's an android, is that someone being an android or not within the movie has no relation to their ability or likelihood to manipulate others. After all, Nathan is a human and he manipulates and lies to Caleb constantly. Caleb is a human and he manipulates Nathan into getting drunk so he can steal his keycard. Does this person really like me? Are they just using me to get something they want? Are they just pretending? Are they even capable of loving another person? These are all questions we could ask of human relationships. They're very human questions. Whether someone is an android or flesh and blood, whether they're manipulating others or telling the truth, this should have no bearing on whether we see them as people. This isn't a story about humans versus androids, it's a story about some people in a place, and ultimately neither Nathan nor Caleb see Kyoko and Ava as people. They see them as women. To Nathan that means something to be controlled and used, and to Caleb that means something to rescue and detain for himself, but fundamentally it means as objects and not as people. So then, Ava locks Caleb inside Nathan's surveillance room and ignores his screams, confirming she was manipulating Caleb as Nathan suggested. I think this is an overly simplistic reading of the ending and stated entirely too concretely, and I hope I've explained another interpretation of the ending well enough that you would agree with me there. And I think it would be good if this page was rewritten to reflect a little bit more of the movie's ambiguity. However, I do need to add, please don't storm off to mass edit the Wikipedia page for this movie. I don't want to be accused of starting some wiki edit raid or something. Anyway.
Thanks a lot for watching, everyone. I have a sore throat today, so I'm having a robot read out my outro. Beep boop. This video was about robots, so this seemed apropos. Thank you especially to all my supporters over on Patreon. Patreon backers get early access to all my videos, and are powerful both physically and mentally. Fear them. Or join them at the link below, if you like. That's all from me today, folks. I'll see you next time.